My name is Gary Himler, Himler, spelled with one M, not with two M's like the infamous Heinrich Himmler of Germany, although my father told me that his uncle changed it from two M's to one, so there may well be a family connection. I was born in Vienna, Austria on June 6, 1925. My birth certificate says Gerhard Himmler, Gerhart, which is an unusual spelling because my mother was infatuated with Gerhard Hauptmann, a Viennese actor. We lived in an apartment from about 1926 until Hitler came. My father was a banker. My mother worked in the same bank. And that's where they met. There was a very easygoing lifestyle. When Hitler, I'm getting ahead of myself. I went to Realschule, which is a preparatory school for engineering, and I noticed some of the students wore these Jäger jackets, hunting jackets. And not until after Hitler came did we realize that those were part of the Hitler Youth uniforms. Well, Hitler invaded Austria in March 1938. And my father never stayed away from excitement, and he asked me if I wanted to see the parade, because Hitler and his people were marching down one main street north of where we lived. And I said, no thank you, and I think ever since I don't like parades. Anyhow, after Hitler came, my dad lost his job. I was expelled from school, and being one of the top 5 or 6% of the students, I was allowed to go to the highest gymnasium, which was the only school available to Jews. Well, I spent, I think, 3 or 4 months there and had to learn Latin, which was not my favorite subject. Anyhow, things didn't get much better, even though my father said, oh, but we're Austrians. They won't do anything to us. Very, very short-sighted. Things didn't get any better, and Kristallnacht came, and the Gestapo arrested both my father and me. I was only 13, but I was tall, over 6 foot. So they arrested both of us. They took me downstairs to the washroom, handed me a bucket and a rag, and said, you clean those urinals. And very innocently I said to the man, but sir, I've never done this before. Could you show me how to do it? So very disdainfully he took the rag and washed the urinal. There were 4 of them. And I said, could you show this to me once more? So he washed the second one, and I washed the other 2. Fair division of labor. Anyhow, after I did all that, they let me back to the apartment. My father didn't come back, and the next thing we knew, that he was in Dachau, the concentration camp. Fortunately, my parents had a visa to the United States, where we had some relatives that we didn't know about in Miami, Florida. But they still weren't able to get out. But on the strength of the visa, my dad was able to get out of Dachau. And he was telling us that they were made to stand there in the freezing weather. Kristallnacht was in November, and he came back in February of the next year. And they sprayed them with water and let the water freeze on their bodies. And my dad's bodies were full of frostbites. And when he was told that he would be released, he would take toilet paper, wet it to make it more transparent and stuffed it into each of the frostbite wounds so that the doctors that inspected them before they could leave the camp wouldn't see it. So he was able to get out of the camp. But it was not a good time for him. Well, because of how bad things were, when an opening came up for me to be able to leave Austria on one of the kinder transports that were done by the who did them? Quaker Society. My parents registered me, and I was able to leave Austria on one of these kinder transports to England. We arrived in London, and a tall, stern lady approached me and says, "Are you Gerhard Himmler?" I said, "Yes, ma'am." I knew a little bit of English because my cousin taught me English, things like language, so she wasn't really the best English teacher, but it's the best I had. And so I lived with the Liddon Thomas family, for a year, almost exactly a year. Mr. Liddon Thomas would leave every day with his wicker basket on his bicycle, selling things like, I imagine, I don't know, cosmetics and stuff. And the family had an upstairs bedroom that they rented out to college students to supplement their income. Well, the Quaker Society had me live there as a college student. I went to school, Surbiton County High School, and everybody stared at me, and I couldn't figure out why. I was 6'1", wearing my lederhosen, and didn't realize that in England, all the kids wore their gray jackets and gray flannel pants. I didn't have a gray jacket or gray flannel pants, nor the money to buy them. So for a year, they all looked at me. Well, so be it. My highlight was English class, where we studied Shakespeare, Hamlet, and of course I was Hamlet. And the performance went on very nicely until Hamlet had to raise his hand and say, "Swear." Well, S-W-E-A-R-H-E-A-R, here, obviously it's swear. Again, nothing but laughter. So it wasn't the easiest year. My parents were able to get out of Austria on August 26, 1939, which was the last train that crossed the German-French border before war was declared. Well, the plan had been that they would go from Le Havre to Southampton. I would meet them in Southampton, and we would go to the United States together. In the meantime, war was declared, and the British government would not allow any ships from the mainland to land on British soil. So they went directly from Le Havre to New York, and they got to New York. They had to start the proceedings all over again for me to be able to join them in the United States, which I did in June 1940. I was in the same convoy crossing the Atlantic Ocean as Queen Wilhelmina of Holland. Submarines all around us. It was an exciting time. In New York, where we landed in Rouse's Point, Canada, and came across there into the United States, and went by bus to New York, where my older cousin met me. He lived in Bridgeport at the time. We spent a couple days together, and then I went to Milwaukee, where my dad picked me up at the railroad station. And again, I remember my dad wanted to buy me a root beer, and I absolutely refused, because I knew that my mother and dad would walk to school at night to save a nickel car fare. so I wasn't going to let him spend a nickel on a Coke for me. Dad, who had been a banker, was at that time going from store to store trying to sell Calgon soap. Fortunately, he was able to secure a position as accountant for a paper company in Milwaukee, and very soon became their business manager and stayed there until he retired. I went 1 year to high school. As I said, at the time I was 14. I went 1 year to high school. I met who was going to become my wife in my senior year there. I then went to summer school and graduated and started college at Marquette University at the age of 15. And I think the last most unpleasant experience was when I was rushed by the Delta fraternity, which was the engineering fraternity at Marquette University, only to receive a letter in the mail saying, "Dear Mr. Himmler, we didn't realize you were Jewish, and Delta fraternity does not accept Jews." That's all I needed at the time. Anyhow, Bess, who became my wife, also went to Marquette. I was able to complete all but the last trimester of school before I found that my draft number was up. And since I wanted to enroll in the electronics program in the Navy, I volunteered so that I could choose the Navy. Went to electronics school in Chicago for a whole year, living in Milwaukee. It was very nice to go home on liberty. And then was assigned to Coronado Island, the amphib base at Coronado Island, for assignment to a Pacific outpost. Well, I got to Coronado Island and reported to ship's company, and the director of ship's company was Lieutenant Commander Simon, whose claim to fame was the fact that he owned a hardware store in Chicago. Well, when I reported to him, he said, he took me back to a large gym full of electronic equipment. And he said, "None of these work. We're in our very last PA system, and if that breaks down, we have no way of having muster. Do you think you could look at them and see if you can fix some of them?" Well, electronics having been my hobby most of my life, it took me about 2 weeks to fix just about everything that was there. And Lieutenant Commander Simon was very happy. And pretty soon he said, "You know, Admiral so-and-so has a radio that stopped working. Do you think you could look at it?" So I said, "I'll be happy to, but you realize I'll need parts, and I'll have to go into San Diego, for which I need transportation." So the next day I had a Jeep assigned to me. So I had my own Jeep. And then I found out that the upstairs was unused. The upstairs of where all that equipment was unused. So I moved the cot and the locker up there and had my own private sleeping quarters instead of sleeping with 200 other people. So I can't complain. I also remember taking my dog Sparky and having his picture taken with a sailor hat and having an ID card made. And I used his ID card more often to get on and off the base than I did mine. So security was not the tightest. Well, I spent 2 years in the Navy. I was discharged, came home, finished my degree at Marquette University, got married. We moved to Chicago, where I did my graduate work at Illinois Institute of Technology, and then moved to Buffalo, New York. To Niagara Falls, New York, where the only job I was able to get was with Bell Aircraft. And I remember Chuck Yeager breaking the sound barrier while I was there, and the helicopters and all that nice stuff. And from there we finally moved to California, Southern California, where we lived for 40 years. We came to, while we lived in California, we spent many a weekend, many a week's vacation in the Phoenix area. We fell in love with the desert. And when I retired in 1990, there was very little doubt where we would live. And so we took one of these 1-week trips to a apartment specifically for that purpose, fell in love with the area, bought a house, and moved here in 1990. Unfortunately, my wife died in 1992. I met another very nice lady, Babette Miller, who was in charge of adult education at Temple Beth Shalom. And we hit it off well. Got married in 1994. Were married for 10 years and had a good life. So, if it hadn't been for Hitler, I would probably still be in Vienna working at some relatively menial engineering job. And not that I'm happy that so many Jews died, which included my uncle and my aunt and my girlfriend, whom I'm sure I would have married. They all died at Auschwitz. But as far as my life is concerned, it probably opened up all sorts of vistas that I never would have had otherwise.
Excellent.
Anything else?
I can't think of anything, can you?
No, I just wish you would have been
I think that brings you right up to date.
That brings you up to date.
Well, almost. Because Babette died 2 years ago, and about 1 year ago, I received a phone call from a lady that I had known for 45 years. We lived a half a mile apart in Northridge, California. Our kids used to play together. We played bridge together. We were very close friends. And I got a phone call from her saying that her second husband had just died. And I was so touched by that she would tell me that I would call her every Sunday. And we just formed a bond. And a year later, she agreed to come and live with me. And that's Beverly. And she's made my life very worthwhile again.
That's wonderful. How many children do you have?
I have 3 children, 2 daughters and a son.
Where do they live?
My oldest daughter, who is adopted, lives in just north of Seattle, in Edmonds. My son, who is also adopted, lives in Lake Havasu. And my younger daughter, who is natural, lives in Hawaii.
Oh. Sounds like a good family. I remember with Spielberg that we used to show pictures of,